was like the perfect song, and you let us sing along. Now you're gone, but your spirit soars in our hearts forevermore.
Hi, welcome to I Pressed On, taking the word depression and rearranging it to something more positive. I'm Brian Chrysagas, and this is my co-host, Barbie Segaris, and I'm so happy to be with you all, but what I'm even more happy about is the guest that we have today. How many of us grew up loving Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher and Elizabeth Taylor, and then there was this little boy, Todd Fisher, who grew up before our eyes. We have Todd with us today, and he's got such a history of legendary people in your life, and you're a legend in yourself. It's amazing. So there's so much we can ask him, because this is old Hollywood.
Right, and I love hearing the whole old Hollywood stories, because growing up, that's all my parents watched were the old Hollywood movies, and your mom and Singing in the Rain and all those songs. So
my mother was a great storyteller. You know, she loved to, and she had all of her fans that followed her, but she was a fan because long before she was a star, she was a fan. And so she grew up very poor and got discovered and became a star, but that was what was cool about her. She had those roots that were the same as everybody, and that she had all her favorite people, and she became this great keeper of stories. Probably the best storyteller I've ever known. And so I have a little of that, you know, from her, I hope.
That's
you do.
Beautiful. Yeah, you really do. What I love about old Hollywood, and there was an era at that time of class and elegance, and that we are missing in today's Hollywood.
It had to be forced. You know, the studio made it happen. They had standards. They made their people live by those standards. They trained them how to behave, not only how to do other things in front of the camera, they also taught you how to behave behind the camera, because their reputation was connected to you. So if you acted or misbehaved, you know, it reflected badly on them. They had people in the studio system that actually enforced these rules.
Wow, which brings me to a question because of that. There was some scandal in your life, but it wasn't you. It was...
Oh, I've had my little bit of scandal.
But your dad and your mom got married, and they were madly in love. And then her best friend was Elizabeth Taylor. And was she in the wedding party?
Yeah, so my mother was her matron of honor.
Wow.
When she married Mike Todd.
Mike Todd. And you are named...
That was my dad's best friend, was Mike Todd.
Really? Okay. Wow. That even gets worse.
Well, the quick version of the story is my mother and father were in Korea in 1952, entertaining the troops. My dad was an enlisted man, but not fighting. He was entertaining. But she actually went over as an entertainer with Keenan Wynn. Studio used to send over, you know, groups of we'll call them the players from MGM, the contract players. Yes. It was great for her though, and she, you know, really it shaped her life in many ways. Her charity side of her life, her compassion for people, and also her dedication to the military. And while she was there, my father saw her entertain, and he was with his best friend, a guy named Bernie Rich, who, you know, he said to Bernie, "I'm going to get that girl. I'm going to marry that girl." He said that to Bernie, and Bernie was like, "Yeah, good luck." And he went home and went out of his way to, you know, meet her, and then he went.
She was adorable.
But he was a big romancer too. You know, narcissists frequently are, and he went out of his way to send over millions of flowers and cars and huge extravagant gifts. You know, and this little girl lives in Burbank in this little house, still living with her parents at the time.
Wow.
And over comes a car with a big ribbon, a Thunderbird, you know, and like, wow. I mean, overwhelming romancing. Wow. But this, of course, led to the marriage, and, you know, then she met Mike. But already my mother was literally in school still on the lot with Liz Taylor, and Roddy McDowell and Margaret O'Brien. They all went to school on the back lot. There's still a little school building there.
That's amazing.
And they literally were educated there. You couldn't just completely quit school. Although in those days it was sort of, I think, almost for show to some degree, because none of them really, they all got sort of honorary degrees.
Well, your mom was America's sweetheart because my grandmother and my mother loved her to pieces, and they always I don't know the way the story went, but they always were angry at Elizabeth Taylor for the longest time because she ruined your mother's
Millions. Well, she
happiness.
didn't really. I mean, yes, like at the moment that this was going on, it was shocking, and
Yeah,
in
it
the
was
country
shocking.
was not ready. Here they had already
scandal.
lifted these people up to these high pedestals of examples to the world of what the sweethearts of America should look like, and then you pull the rug out from underneath them. But my dad, really wasn't up for it, And then when you look at it years later, when I say up for it, meaning the marriage. I mean, the guy was so self-absorbed that to have stuck her in that, it wouldn't have been necessarily the greatest thing in the long run. But at the time, it was certainly shocking. And Elizabeth, years later, I became good friends with Liz, and I knew her along the way, even though she was my godmother and stepmother during the divorce era and for a certain period of time while my dad and her were married. I didn't really become friendly with her personally until in my 30s, and then she took it upon herself to really go out of her way to explain what had happened. And, in a way, and it came across to me like she was trying to justify the thing to me.
Yes.
And I stopped her. I said, it's not necessary. Water over the dam. We love you. America loves you.
Yes.
Everybody's over it. And she says, well, I want you to understand. And she basically explained about how madly in love she was with Mike Todd.
Yeah.
And she proceeded to say he was the love of her life. And, and when he died suddenly, it was shocking to her. And we all know the rebound story.
Right.
You
Yes.
suffer a great
Sorrow.
loss
Yes.
like that, and you do possibly don't know quite how to behave. Everybody
Yes.
scrambles.
Yes.
Especially she was young. These girls were in their 20s when all this madness is going on. So, she runs. My sister says it best. She says, when this tragedy occurred, my father rushed to Elizabeth's side, gradually moving his way around to the front. And of course, that was shocking when it happened. That's what the world hated. I've run
Right.
into people, thousands of people have said to me, oh, this is how terrible it was. And, it'd have hurt Carrie more than me. This is, so tragedy, loss, things like this affect you differently. Even though we were a year
Yes.
apart, my sister was young enough to have bonded with him. I never did. I bonded with my mother, fortunately, because she was solid. But, she had bonded somewhat with my father, and of course he
But
was,
she was Daddy's little girl.
yeah. And there's film to prove all of this. He
Right.
was around enough. And so when he disappeared, she actually felt the loss as a young child, whereas I didn't hardly notice it.
Yeah. Wow. But what you said about Elizabeth Taylor, one thing I loved about before she had passed, I don't know if you knew this, but she was on the talk show and she was talking about she had died and come back. Did you know
Yes,
this?
yes.
And she saw Mike Todd. Did you?
Yes.
And he was in heaven, and he told her to go back. And what a powerful story that, and her agent told her to be quiet because this is going to ruin her.
I think people told her that many times during her career, and nothing ever ruined her.
Amen. Nothing did. She was like, she just kept getting back up.
And that's a tribute to people that were from that era. I'd say it's also the way she was trained at the studio. She was very, very tough and could survive a lot. But, did it differently than my mother. My
Yes.
mother's survival and overcoming great obstacles was done through faith. And
That's
her belief in Christ and her belief that God was with her and she didn't walk alone. And so no matter how horrific everything seemed to be around her, she always felt that stability.
That's awesome.
Now, people can say what I just said pretty easily.
Yes.
But it's another thing to believe it so much that it's real and you just move on. I mean, so if you don't really believe it or really understand it, yet you could say it, you might end up thoroughly depressed.
Yes. Very true. Very, very true.
And not knowing how to overcome it. But
Yes.
I'm telling you from the back seat where I sat watching her life, man, I don't know anybody more resilient who would get hit with like stuff that would knock most people down permanently. She'd be right back up
So
again.
she was very much like the role Unsinkable Molly Brown.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's why she fought for that role. She's like, "Hey, this is me."
That's awesome.
And the director didn't think that. Charles Walters was vehemently opposed to her playing that part and said,
That's
"You're much
amazing.
too small for the part."
Yeah.
So she went to his house and said, well, how small is the part? And he was like, no, that's not what I meant. I meant you're too small.
Short.
And she's, but you know, but my mother was something else.
Tough.
She's dynamite. I mean, I watched her knock two full-grown men to the floor with a punch, a
Wowza.
single punch.
Wow.
Right, at 98 pounds.
And your dad dared to do what he did?
Oh, he was definitely scared of her.
Wow.
For sure. I mean, he actually used that excuse at one point early on where he's like, well, I would have been around more if I wasn't so afraid of Debbie. You know, she was too intense. And my mother would just simply say to you, but you were so unbelievably flaky that you would have just done damage to the children. So I was protecting the children where you're once again thinking about yourself. How does this all affect me? And thus the story of the narcissist in our world.
Yes.
Did she encourage you both to get into the show business, or she did not want you to be
neither one of us. I mean, it started with us, you know, as young children doing some cameo stuff on her stage with her. Eventually we performed with her, and she was careful to listen to what we had. Carrie loved it, and I was constantly saying, look, I mean, I don't mind doing this, but like, you know, at 8 years old, having to put on makeup every day and blow the whole summer in Las Vegas, you know, it's like, I mean, it just wasn't like something that I think it had to do with my age, but, you know, boys certainly react to things differently. And I also gravitated towards the technical side of things. And, you know, we had different experiences. You know, I became a Christian pretty early in my 20s, and it did affect my trajectory of what I was doing and how in my storytelling.
Well, I got to tell you, I got to know you really well, and now I just admire everything about you. And not only are you a Christian, but I didn't. Last time I had met you, and I'm staying with you, but I realized that you were a minister.
Right.
And that blows me away. I never knew you were a minister. I knew you loved Jesus, and I knew you had such strong faith, but to know that you also have the education behind it.
Well, I rejected the notion. You know, we had started a church. I had a television show and it was pretty successful, and we started a church around the same time. And it got, by today's standards, you'd call it sort of a mega church of type. It was, you know, had several thousand people, and everybody was like, "Oh, we need to ordain you as a pastor of this church," and I was like, "No." And they're like, "Why not? You know, I mean, you're doing sort of this work." And I said, "I don't mind building this church, and I don't mind being part of it and supporting the people. But I don't see myself. I just never identified with that." Later on, Ken Copeland and a guy named Norval Hayes came to me, and they ordained me as a evangelist. I could identify with that because I always felt there were plenty of people preaching to the choir. They didn't need me for that.
Yeah.
Although I could tell some fun stories, and I used to sometimes sit in at the church and, you know, take over for a Sunday or two, but I was not my bag. I really preferred talking to the people that were in need rather than the choir.
Yes.
You know, preaching to the choir was just, there was a lot of that. I used to say that when I do TBN. I was like, look, I'm not putting you guys down, you know, but you are just talking to the choir, you realize. Because most people I know are not watching your channel.
Well, you did a TV show for Paul and Jan Crouch, right?
I did.
Yeah.
And it was very successful in that mission that we communicated with people that would otherwise not be watching that. And the message is the same, but it's packaged differently. Yeah. If you think about Jesus running around the earth, and I always used to spend time thinking about this, like how would he relate to people? How would he be communicating with people? And it would never be straight out and blast you over the head and drag you into church.
No,
and there would be no stained glass windows and pews, and we wouldn't be playing. He would have approached it the way he did approach it at the time.
Yes.
So I always wanted to play with parables and come around the corner the back way.
I watched your show, and I was watching several of those episodes, and it was hysterical. It was a Saturday Night Live type thing with Christian principles. And
right, but it was irreverent by certain Christian standards. In fact, we were on the bloody edge of the cutting edge of what was satire and what was in bad taste. and I would sometimes fall off to the side there, but that's what comedy is, you know. So
taking risks.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's happened today. You know, you like doing comedy, you can't even hardly do it without running a risk of being in trouble immediately. Yeah. That's impossible if you're really going to do comedy. And you'll talk to any comedian, and I don't consider myself a comedian, but I do understand directing and producing comedic content.
Yes.
And you cannot have all these rules in place and you got to be able to run risk.
Yeah.
You got to offend somebody.
Yeah.
Paul
Well,
Crouch came into my room when we were putting the first show together, and he could, by contract, he didn't get to see anything I was doing, which was unheard of for them. But they had never dealt with my entertainment lawyer before either, so they got themselves in a little bit of a pickle. But he finally convinced me to show him something. So I showed him a character in my show called Reverend Hype, played by Jerry Hauser,
Wow.
who was in Summer of
Yeah,
42.
with Jennifer Aniston.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Jerry, he would go, brothers and sisters, thank you for letting me into your homes. And speaking of money, and then he would do a monologue about begging for money. And
Yes.
one of the things that affected me the most or kept me away from becoming Christian was all of these ministers begging for money all the time.
Yes.
That used to really quench me out. I was like, this is disturbing to me. God does not need to beg for money. So we just did a satire on it. And Paul Crouch looked at this thing when it was done, and he was more gray than he already was. And he was like, I don't get it. I said, perfect. Wait, perfect. He goes, what do you mean perfect? I said, it's not for you.
Yes.
It's not for you. I don't need you to get it. It's not. Did you not ask me to make a show for everybody else? You go ahead and have all of. When I was on his show for one of the first times as a guest, he asked me, why don't young people watch this show or identify the show? And I said, well, this is a live show. You really don't want me to answer that question, do you? And he said, no, we really do. I said, all right, you asked for it. And I said, look at this set. It looks like a lobby to a Ramada Inn. Wow. I said, look at the powder blue suit you're wearing. I mean, it went out with seersucker. I mean, and then I said to Jan, I said, frankly, the makeup and hair is like, whew, man. And but it had an impact on them in a good way, and then they give them credit. They turn me loose. That's dangerous. Very dangerous.
But at the same time, it was needed. Do you know what I mean? Because the problem with Christians today is they're not being real. And I think you're authentic, and you're what the church needs today is that type of just realness.
I had a fake book that I sold on my show called Christian Ease.
Yes.
Christian terminology made easy.
Yes.
And I did that as a joke, and I had Pat Boone and other people in it because, you can listen to some Christians and they start talking another language, and the average person is like, is that, what language are you talking? Yeah. So if you're trying to be identifiable, you do have to kind of watch the Christian vernacular. Assuming, look, if you're at church and hanging with your friends and everybody's talking the lingo, that's fine. But if you're trying to go outside of that, you do want to be identifiable. One thing about my mother is that she was a very strong Christian and had a very strong testimony, quote unquote.
That's beautiful.
But she did it always like such clever ways of telling her truths by experience and by example.
Yeah.
Like, so.
Well, that's the best.
Right. Because, you could say, here's how it works. Or you can say, that's how I got through everything that I just did. Yeah. I just did this. Okay. So you can do it.
Yeah.
That's a way better story than this is the words that if you do this, this, and this, somehow maybe you can work it through. And you've never done it yourself.
Well, that's why we're doing this show, is because we want to show people that they can press on, and it doesn't need to be just this certain cookie cutter way of what Christianese would tell you to do. But you had an experience of because of what they've
I just
gone
wanted
through.
to ask you, like, your relationship with your sister. Were you close, or was there?
We were best friends. I mean, we grew up together. When I was 1 year old, man, I was in the bathtub with her, and we would play together. I was actually like her toy. If you watch like our home movies, she was always washing my hair and
that was me with my brother and sister. So I know what you mean.
Okay, but so it starts with that, right? But that's the foundation for a lifelong relationship of sort of the unspoken connection. And so we had this deep connection. I found myself many times being a mediator between my mother and sister. They had a very broken relationship early on, which has been outlined in Carrie's movie and book, Postcard from the Edge. And they had a tough time because Carrie was having a hard time dealing with her, accepting her, and also just accepting that my mother loved her unconditionally. This is a hard thing sometimes for mothers and daughters or fathers and sons. There are dynamics. Right. She couldn't accept it, yet it was always there. And she did have an epiphany later and got it. But, we were always there. We traveled together. When she broke up with Paul Simon, I had broken up with my first wife, and we lived together and traveled together and played together. you know, there's a talk show that I did many years ago with her and my mother on it, right when they were still strained in their relationship. But literally, Carrie and I were finishing each other's sentences like,
Like
you
me
would
and
have
my
been with your
20
brother.
Yeah, oh, we did all the time. Yeah.
But it's like that. Like when you've spent that much time with somebody, you know, they're part of you in that way. And the only reason why you know, losing Carrie was tough, you know, because it was unexpected, and it wasn't totally unexpected because we knew Carrie was a high risk sport. Yeah. You know, she was always with her drug issues and her bipolar disorder. She was always high risk. So you were like hoping that the shoe wouldn't drop, but I felt. You know, I always had faith that God would somehow keep her with us, and did for a very long time. I mean, I'm not totally disappointed with what happened in the sense that she did so much and accomplished so much. And many people that would have been in her situation probably not necessarily could have overcome all the things she did.
She was amazing.
But as a person looking at that later when we lost her, you know, if it wasn't
and
for
then
my
your
faith,
mother.
well, simultaneously, you know, the day later. But that was a little more expected. And my mother, of course, you know, I've told the story on 2020, you know, she literally told me what was happening. She was going to leave and go be with Carrie, and just in those many words looked in my face and told me that, and I thought she was being ethereal. But then she just closed her eyes, went to sleep, and I was looking at her and I was like,
Wow.
she just left the building.
She knew.
She told me she was leaving, and she
She
did.
must have been that connected with God that she knew that it was time.
You know, it's hard to explain it. She didn't make it about that. You know, she didn't make it about God in particular. It was like her choice. Like, you know, I hope you're going to be okay when I leave. Sure. Yeah, of course, you know, and then on from there. So, but then looking at the Carrie situation, you know, you have Carrie leaving in a sort of disturbing, kind of shocking, short notice way. And, you know, for me, if it wasn't for my roots and my faith and all of that, I would have been way different for me.
Awesome.
I'm not saying it's something you like,
No.
but you can deal with it. I'm not alone. I have a beautiful wife. You know my wife.
do?
Kathy.
Oh my gosh.
You know, she's awesome.
Bring that up.
I at the time had a lot of different pets. All of that is part of your package, right? But ultimately, when you see through all of that, past the hand, you know, what are you connected to?
Well, we want to bring Catherine up real quick,
Yes.
but I also want to talk real fast about the bipolar. You brought that up
Yes.
because there's a lot of people dealing with people who are bipolar.
Right.
So how did you deal with that? What would you tell somebody who's dealing
The
with
fast answer, and I can elaborate on this, is you love them through it. My mother was told a lot of different ways on how to deal with it. Now, of course, they get help with doctors and things, that you don't ignore that.
Right.
Carrie tried many different things, but there was a lot of ups and downs within the psychotropic drug world, and it was difficult. I mean, Carrie had a lot of difficult times. And my mother always did not take the advice of anybody unless it was, I'm going to love her through this. Because she had many friends that took other roads, other paths, tough love kind of approach to things, and those people were no longer with us. So her plan was, whatever keeps her here the longest is my plan. And so she loved her to the bitter end.
That's
Even
beautiful.
in our little HBO special, Bright Lights, you know, you see her, she actually has a thing in there where she says, you know, it's tough, but we hang in there. We love her.
We need to bring you back and do a show on that, because I think that's something, there's so much bipolar out there and people are dealing with it.
I've had
and-
actors, I've had civilians come up. They all have family members. They all have brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers. It's almost in every household that I've experienced. And they all are like, well, how do you do that?
Yeah.
So how do you love somebody through that is not a quick answer.
yeah.
I mean, I'm using a word generically, but there's a lot to that, because, you
Yes.
know, you're going to be faced with things where you're not going to want to love them.
Oh, yeah.
You're
Oh,
going to
yeah.
say, go to your room.
And their moods switch so quickly that you don't know. It's like walking on eggshells every time you're around them.
Right.
So, but I want to bring up beautiful Catherine, if we could. She's such an inspiration, and you did well. She's a
is.
keeper.
She's my muse.
Just come over here and just say, I only waited 40-something years. I'm coming down because I got to share this.
You got to share the mic.
But I went to that church that you all were talking about
Yes.
Before we knew each other.
before
Wow.
we knew each other. 40, how many years ago? What
That-
year
that-
did you start that? In the late 70s?
No, it was like 80.
80s?
It's like 80.
Yeah. So I went to
Just
that
a few years
church,
ago.
and I would see him across the church. And he was married, and of course I was married, and I didn't have any thoughts like that. But what I did think at that time was, I wish that I had a man that loved the Lord like he
That's
does.
beautiful.
Because it's in my mind, it's almost a near impossibility to have a marriage that lasts without it.
That's beautiful.
And
God heard that prayer, and look what he did.
40
Shook up a lot of
something
people.
years
40
later.
Oh my gosh.
So
And
I
you
love
crushed
that.
my
Yeah.
brother Anthony's heart. Okay, he has been in love with you since he saw that poster.
And I've never met him.
No,
so
you've
that's-
never met him.
That's right. So that's
But that is a very important lesson, that
Right.
every little decision,
yeah.
how it splits and goes, and other people come in your life and other
Right.
decisions, so complicated the way you can get from point A to point B.
That's beautiful.
And if, since I can't predict or understand it, isn't it nice to know that there's someone who does know?
Amen.
And so if you can trust that God can help you make those right choices, or you give him that,
Yes.
shall we say, opening in your life to help me make those right moves, that leads you to this.
Oh, amen.
Right.
That's beautiful.
But I didn't know. I mean, that's ultimately what I would have liked to
He
have
guided
had,
your steps
but I made
along
all
the
the
way.
wrong moves early on. My mother warned me.
Well,
I
but
blew her off.
I have to tell you, before Catherine was ever with you, because I've known Catherine for about 20 years now, and she always reminded me of a Debbie Reynolds, because she
Yes.
was an actress, she was a beautiful
Singer,
singer.
yeah.
You still are, and I'd always think to myself, and she was such a pretty petite blonde, and I just always thought she's like a
Wow.
Debbie Reynolds.
How about
and
that?
then she ends up.
Well, my mother, after they first had their first interview, my mother interviewed her here in Vegas without me.
She took me to dinner.
Yeah.
That's the first time I met her.
But they sent me a little picture of the two, and I was sitting there. My mother afterwards that called me, and she said, "She's a good girl."
I love it. I love
That
it.
was quite
I can't believe it. We ran out of time, but the thing is, we're going to bring you both back on again.
Yes.
Certainly.
And Catherine, we're going to have a
Yes.
show with you too.
Yep.
God has been doing such a wonderful job with the two of you, and God has more plans for you, and we love you dearly. So I want to just close with telling everybody that we thank you all for joining us, and until next time, God bless.
Thank you.
For more information about I Pressed on podcast, visit chrisaugustministries.com. Find out who our next guests will be, as well as airtimes and dates. Please consider making a donation. Your donation helps fund all of the ways we spread God's word and testimony.
Your life was like the perfect song, and you let us sing along. Now you're gone, but your spirit soars in our hearts forevermore.